Good evening. I'm truly honored to be here with you, and I'm absolutely wowed by the museum. My congratulations go to those who put it together, and it's wonderful to have something like this right here in the heart of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And Professor Wilkins talked about having walked up the street, or 0.8 miles. I flew from Jamaica. So I am very glad to be here with you tonight. I do want to take a little bit of a different tack, though, in talking about religious freedom and the connection, its biblical roots. In the two excellent presentations we've heard, there's really been a focus on something which is fundamental and which I agree with wholeheartedly, which is it's an inalienable right, that it is intrinsic to being human, that we have the right to follow our conscience, and out of that, closely related to that, fundamental to that, the right for religious freedom. But from the perspective of the Black church, it's really about what has happened over the course of history. And in fact, if you think about it, God doesn't just declare that we have religious freedom, he demonstrates it. And it starts with the story of Exodus. Think about it. Moses goes to meet with Pharaoh. And what does he do? He says, God has commanded us to leave and to go to a place to worship him. And when Pharaoh refuses to allow them to go, he's not merely disobeying God, he's abrogating their right to religious freedom. He's denying them the right to religious freedom. Because religious freedom is about the right to follow God. And it's not just about the right to freedom of worship, that we can, in our churches and in our bedrooms and in our homes, worship. It's about the right to act in response to our understanding of God's calling on our lives. It's about the right to do it not just in private, but also to do it in public. So God starts with an action that demonstrates the importance, the power of religious freedom. And for the Black church, that is a central motif that runs throughout our history, the idea of the Exodus. Because for us, the Civil War was an exodus. It was a crossing over from slavery to freedom. It was an act of judgment by God. And it's rooted really in the understanding of biblical faith. Because those Black and white abolitionists who worked to bring about that exodus, they were largely people of faith, people who believed the Bible and who lived it out. Sojourner Truth, an itinerant preacher, a woman who was an abolitionist, herself a former slave, who argued against slavery powerfully, who argued for the rights of women long before our current focus on equality. And all of this came out of her powerful faith, out of her understanding of the biblical meaning of what it was to follow God. The same is true of John Brown, who takes on Harper's Ferry. John Brown's actions are about his understanding of God's absolute judgment on the horror of slavery. Again, rooted in his exercise of his religious freedom and growing out of biblical faith. The same is true for Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman saw herself as on a mission guided and protected by God himself. Rooted in her biblical faith, she has the courage to go back into the South after escaping from slavery. She goes back into the South to free 300 other enslaved people on 19 trips. The power of religious freedom being exercised and in action. But that's not the only Exodus event in the history of the Black church. Think about the civil rights movement an exodus from disenfranchisement and terror in the southern United States into full citizenship. And in the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, there is nothing greater in the world than freedom. I would rather die in abject poverty with my convictions than live in inordinate riches with lack of self-respect. For him, religious freedom was expressed in all of the work of the civil rights movement. We were talking about this earlier today. The fact that the importance of King's faith in his role in the civil rights movement, the importance of the church, the black church in the civil rights movement, is fading from view, perhaps being blotted out. And the focus is on Dr. King rather than on Reverend King. But this was a man driven by his faith, strengthened by his faith. He endured death threats, bombings of his home, endangering his wife and children based on the strength of his faith. See, early in the campaign, the bus boycott in Montgomery, King is terrified by the rising violence. And in the middle of the night, he's sitting in his kitchen trying to figure out, what do I do? And he has a revelation. He hears Jesus speaking to him and telling him that he must have faith and that he must stand up for righteousness and that he must do what is right. And as he hears this, it becomes a mantra that he goes back to time and time again when he faces crisis in pursuing the civil rights movement. He's strengthened by the memory of that experience. In fact, David Garrow, who, as far as I know, is not a man of faith at all, writes a powerful biography of King, which doesn't come at it from a religious perspective. I mean, it's completely secular, but the theme keeps coming back, even through the eyes of a secular writer, how important that revelation was to King's having the strength to do what he did. But King was not the only one. There was Reverend Fred Shuttleworth, Ralph Abernathy, Joseph Lowry. All of them, it was the black clergy, it was men of faith, acting on their religious freedom, exercising religious freedom, who led the civil rights movement. But let us not forget that without the tens of thousands of black church-going people, people of faith who took to the streets, those leaders could not have done anything. And the power of the church in this movement is indicated when King is involved in naming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was going to be called the Southern Leadership Conference. But King says, no, this has to be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, because he knows that black people are rooted in biblical faith. He knows that it is going to take those all-night prayer and praise and singing and preaching sessions in black churches the night before they hit the streets for them to have the strength to withstand police truncheons, police dogs, fire hoses, without retaliating with violence. The story of the civil rights movement, the victories of the civil rights movement, is the victories of the black church of religious freedom being exercised. And it's very appropriate that we talk about this tonight because just yesterday we celebrated Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Day. But even today, the exercise of religious freedom is so critical in the black community. Because, I do want to say one other thing, and that is, I want you to have a sense of how important this biblical interpretation is to King. Because he bases his passionate advocacy for the struggle for civil rights in a biblical understanding. And you see it in the I Have a Dream speech. He quotes Isaiah 40 in describing his vision for African Americans, his vision of the future. I have a dream that one day every valley will be exalted, every hill and mountain made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. So King is explicitly championing the responsibility of every Christian to follow his or her conscience and obey God's calling when any conflict arises between the two, between God's calling and the duty to civil society, which Professor Wilkins was talking about earlier, that religious freedom takes precedence. So in his sermon titled Paul's Letter to American Christians, he says, "Be not conformed to the world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." So this is an imaginary letter. He imagines Paul writing to American Christians, and Paul goes on to say in this imaginary letter, "Or as I said to the Philippian Christians, you are a colony of heaven." This means that although you live in a colony of time, your ultimate allegiance is to the empire of eternity. You have a dual citizenry. You live both in time and eternity, both in heaven and earth. Therefore, your ultimate allegiance is not to the government, not to the state, not to the nation, not to any man-made institution. The Christian owes his ultimate allegiance to God. And if any earthly institution conflicts with God's will, it is your Christian duty to take a stand against it. This is a perfect expression of religious freedom, and it's grounded in his understanding of the biblical mandate. This was reflected also in the final speech that King gives, his mountaintop oration, which is actually made the night before he's murdered. And he's talking about having been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land, but like Moses, he may not cross over with us. It's as though he knew what was going to happen the next day. He likens his journey to that of Moses, and the entire movement is, in his eyes, a minor exodus of the southern black person from terror and disenfranchisement to full citizenship. But more than that, King saw the whole strategy, the nonviolent strategy of the civil rights movement, this winning strategy, as consistent with biblical teaching. He said, "Violence creates many more social problems than it solves. And as I've said in so many instances, the Negro in particular, and colored peoples all over the world, in their struggle for freedom, if they succumb to the temptation of using violence for their struggle, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desperate night of bitterness." And the biblical source he's using is Matthew's words, Jesus' words in Matthew. In the 5th chapter of the gospel, as recorded by St. Matthew, we read these very arresting words flowing from the lips of our Lord and Master. "You have heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for those that despitefully use you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven." His entire strategy is seen as coming from the lips of Jesus as recorded in Matthew. So for the black church, religious freedom, yes, it's an inalienable right, but even more, it is exercised, it is freedom, it is our exodus. And so religious freedom and its biblical roots are essential to the faith of the black church.